Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Misinformation. It's a problem. Something we can all agree on, right? But these days, it's not that simple. Who decides what's misinformation? And what if what one person says is misinformation is still adding value to someone else's life? During the pandemic, we often agreed that the country was awash in falsehoods, misleading characterizations. And now with algorithms and AI, we're getting our own customized truths. Which brings us to today's episode. Are we even thinking about misinformation the right way? Why is, quote, fighting misinformation such a divisive concept? Our guests today are two researchers who have spent years studying misinformation, and they say we all need to think about it differently. It's not all about health literacy or access to facts, and no, one side of our divide isn't more susceptible than the other. Instead, they say the spread of misinformation comes down to what it provides us, its value. Does it answer a question for someone that no one else is answering? Does it help us make sense of confusing or conflicting science? Does it fill a silent void? Does it tie us to a community? In other words, the question isn't, how did we fall for it? It's, what's it doing for us? And if that's right, what does it mean for those who see fact-checking or deplatforming as the only response? There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. It is good to be with y'all. Guys, last week was a pretty big episode for us. We were down in Washington, D.C. We spoke with Dr. Oz, who heads up the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. If you haven't checked that episode out, we recommend you do. And head over to YouTube where you'll find a video of the interview. That's kind of rare for us. We got into a cool studio, and it was fun to have cameras, professional cameras filming us for a second. So we have a really interesting episode today, and I think it's going to spark a lot of thought. But first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdumalik.
Yeah, and this is Why Should I Trust You, which is all about the breakdown in trust in public health, medicine, science, and AI. And a reminder, send us your thoughts by emailing questions at whyshoulditrustyou.net.
Okay, so we have these two researchers with us today, Michael Simeone and Kristy Roschke. They're going to join us in a little bit. And I was just thinking, we're doing this episode about misinformation and putting it in context and understanding what it is. And it's a word that we don't often use on the show. I just want to be very open about that. And I think it's because, Tom, we know that it's a word that a lot of people, they feel judged when they're being told that something they're looking at is misinformation. And I know I've often struggled with it because I don't want someone to sort of feel judged for believing what they believe. I want to understand why they believe in what they believe. But that said, I think it's important to note that there are such things as facts out there. And I think as a society now, that tension and that dynamic is so central to so many of our conflicts.
Yeah, I think it was, pretty compelling when, we're saying, well, what do we call things that are falsehoods? The response we got was do better, come up with a more descriptive way to talk about what's wrong with this piece of information. Don't just take this kind of lazy, dismissive way out by saying it's all misinformation, because parts of it might be accurate, other parts may be false. And the whole thing was just coming off as arrogant to dismiss it as all misinformation.
One of the things for me is we owe people this idea that we're going to be empathetic and compassionate. But, as scientists, doctors, you also owe people reality. And somewhere in between there is where what we're discussing today.
Yeah, I think it should be really interesting when these two researchers come on. So before we get to them, Tom, help us get to speed on misinformation.
Yeah, so before you get bummed out, it turns out humans aren't the only species that spread misinformation.
What?
Yeah. Apparently fish do it too. Yeah, a group of researchers from
smelly
Cornell,
little suckers always seem like liars to me.
Exactly. A group of researchers from Cornell University was studying schools of fish, as well as other organisms, and how they communicated with each other. And then they had an aha moment. They observed that sometimes the fish darting away from the others in a school sent a message to the group that there was a genuine threat lurking. Other times, the fish darting off signaled that there was danger when there was clearly no danger. It was misinformation, and it resulted.
I need to see a video. I need to see a video of this, Tom.
Yeah, we're going to put that on our YouTube page. And it resulted in some fish panicking and fleeing from a danger that never existed, but not all of them. So the researchers found that while the false message screaming danger was the same in both circumstances, not all fish read the message the same way. So, in short, how a fish interprets misinformation matters as much as the misinformation itself. And obviously that's fish. What about humans? During the pandemic, we saw, this massive collapse of trust and conflicting messages. And this spread of misinformation was turbocharged by social media platforms and their algorithms. And add to that today, this rise of artificial intelligence, which gives users the ability to generate realistic images and videos. And experts say we're seeing this new sort of phenomena playing out in the misinformation space, especially when it comes to the hantavirus outbreak. There are claims that it's a hoax. There are claims that the virus is a side effect of the COVID vaccine, or that the whole thing is just being blown out of proportion as a pretext for government lockdowns. And AI, they say, is playing now a big role in spreading those messages.
All right. Researchers say they're observing more and more health and science misinformation, but the truth is we don't actually know how much misinformation is out there. What we do know is that a lot of the most watched health content isn't coming from medical experts, and a lot of that is wrong. One study looked at TikTok videos about sinusitis. Basically, that's the pain you get in your cheeks and your sinuses during like cold or allergy season or an infection. It's a popular topic. There were 221 videos that these researchers looked at, and they had a lot of views, 300 million views, 1 million shares. But the kicker is that nearly half the videos came from non-medical sources, which is totally fine. But the ones presenting themselves as educational, fewer than half were accurate. We also know that more and more Americans are turning to social media for their health information, and they aren't double checking what they find. So according to KFF, 3 in 10 adults today are using social media at least monthly for this kind of advice. And many of them believe that they can sort out the good information from the bad. But how good are they at that? We don't know. 61% say they're confident they can tell what's true or false when it comes from social media, and 56% say the same about information from, say, AI chatbots. But only a third say they follow up with a doctor or healthcare provider to make sure what they saw and the guidance they got online was correct. And I see this all the time as a skin cancer surgeon. I see how it shows up in my practice. I see it in my own social media feeds. I mean, because I have this algorithm that thinks I'm interested in skin cancer, which I am, I guess, as a skin cancer surgeon, I'm fed these accounts that reframe skin cancer around topics like cellular health, root causes, toxins, minerals, metabolism. And the danger is that the language on these videos and the visuals is very warm, very personal. But some of the advice and posts do take it a step further. They want to sound like healing, but the messages underneath is often like what we talk about here, distrust. You'll see phrases and hear phrases like, this is what your dermatologist isn't telling you, or, what your doctor doesn't want you to know, or what your medical team is getting wrong, or your medical team is behind. And the more serious concern isn't just that someone believes something inaccurate online, it's that a real skin cancer gets undetected, or, a melanoma can become more invasive. All of these, like the survey said, is that maybe somebody doesn't go to the doctor to get a biopsy, or maybe it's like a rare skin cancer that the video isn't mentioning. And because social media is just that, it's social, the delay isn't just with that one person, right? These things get shared, and now there are people with similar issues, or maybe not so similar issues. They may have found a compelling reason to not go to the doctor. Given all this, it's not surprising that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine decided to do a deep dive into what misinformation is and how it's spreading. So let's reset here. In broad terms, misinformation may be shared without the intent to deceive. But disinformation is something a little bit different, and that's an intentional deception. So it's a little bit more nefarious. This committee from the National Academy started by coming up with a more precise definition of misinformation about science. They wrote that it is information that asserts or implies claims that are inconsistent with the weight of accepted scientific evidence at the time. And importantly, which claims are determined to be misinformation about science can evolve over time as new evidence accumulates. What I like that they found and they highlighted is that none of us are immune to this. Writing, while all people have the potential to believe misinformation, individuals are more likely to engage with misinformation and ultimately believe it when it aligns with their worldview and values. So if it originates from a source that they trust, is repeated, and or is about a topic for which they lack strong pre-existing attitudes and beliefs.
Yeah, and Mark, I just want to say that one of the things that I notice in our conversations with people is a real desire to understand how someone like came to the point of calling something misinformation, right? Because I think when you put there that it's based on accepted scientific evidence, we're in a moment now where that accepted scientific evidence often needs to be explained to people in order to make the case that this thing is misinformation or not. And so I just want to put out there that I think that is also something that this moment struggles with, is while we absolutely agree that there need to be sort of shared facts in order to like function as a society, we are observing that who gets to decide what is a fact is increasingly coming under scrutiny.
That is literally what they talk about as one of the hardest truths in this field. And it can be hard for some people to accept. And the fact is, facts alone are not enough. And then the response, does pumping out more and more facts, does that even make much of a difference? So they say, quote, science literacy alone does not ensure that an individual will be less prone to believing misinformation about science. And finally, they call out to other researchers saying our limited understanding of misinformation about science at higher levels and larger scales is impeding our progress. So it's not just the bad post. It's not just the false claim. It's the entire system that helps all of this travel that we need a better understanding of. And so enter the research team who will be joining us in a moment, who are doing just that.
Yeah, in the researchers we're going to speak with today, they published a big article in NPJ Complexity, which is a peer-reviewed journal, part of the Nature family of journals, and they lay out a new comprehensive way of thinking about misinformation. And we're going to get into all this, but just the basics. They emphasize the entire ecosystem in which misinformation spreads, and they get to the core reasons why we spread it. They call it vulnerability and value framework. And they write that understanding vulnerability to misinformation is best achieved by considering the value that that misinformation holds for those who engage with it. In other words, we're all vulnerable to misinformation, and that vulnerability is based on the value it provides us, which could be linked to our feelings, our grievances, our fears, our friends, our desires to be accepted by a community. And yes, also the interests and value it provides to a commercial social platform that we're existing on. They don't let individuals or bad actors off the hook, but they say if you truly want to understand why someone embraces something that you believe is false, you need to first understand what that information is providing them.
Tom, and I think what's so striking is that misinformation isn't just changing what people believe. Nearly 7 in 10 Americans say it's damaging confidence in institutions. This is from a Pew study. And more than half say it's eroding trust in each other. So this is just as much of a trust problem as it is an information problem.
Okay, that was great, you guys. I am really interested in this conversation. These are terms that I've always kind of like, it's always sat a little funny with me. And so I'm really eager to, get into it with these researchers to help me understand it a little bit better. So we are ready to bring on the researchers to explain this new approach and what it means for those who are trying to answer misinformation with just more and more facts. We'll be right back. And a big Why Should I Trust You? Welcome to Michael Simeone and Kristy Roschke. Both these guys have the word trust front and center in their bios of what they focus their research on. We love that. So let's start with Michael. Michael Simeone is an information systems researcher at Arizona State University who studies misinformation, AI, and how digital information systems shape public understanding, political communication, collective decision-making, and trust. Kristy Roschke is a media literacy researcher at Vanderbilt University who studies trust in media, health misinformation, and how people navigate today's increasingly complex information environment. Welcome to the show, Michael and Kristy.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us. We're excited.
So I'm going to start with you, Michael. So you both co-authored this peer-reviewed article titled Value and Vulnerability, a Framework for Understanding the Complexity of Misinformation Use. In your article, you write, quote, understanding vulnerability to misinformation is best achieved by considering the value that misinformation holds for those who engage with it. I've just found that such a fascinating framework. What do you mean by the value that misinformation holds?
Yeah, so in thinking through how to approach misinformation and influence, a lot of our conversations early on, we really started thinking about why people adopt this stuff, because it can't just all be duplicity. It can't all just be a game of deception and defending against deception. Not trying to undersell that as a dynamic, certainly important. And we're certainly not the only researchers to try to think through that specific nuance. But the idea that misinformation can have value to people that is more than just like empirical facts is really important, right? Entertainment is a really nice example of this, that we can, transmit what is technically information, but it has value beyond empirical validation, or it has value beyond just factuality. And so when we think about why people seek out information, why they actually hold on to it or pass it along, it is more than just trying to figure out what's right and true in the world, that there's a lot of variety in how people interact with these environments that are just so densely packed with information. So we're trying to create a kind of broader understanding of how people engage with these systems and why.
Yeah, and I definitely want to, we're going to unpack the value that misinformation holds. But Kristy, the story that I often hear about misinformation is the following, which is that we are these empty vessels and we go online, and very well-financed networks of bad faith actors like emits information into our brains, and the right approach to solving this crisis is getting at that well-financed group of misinformation purveyors. How does that story sit with you, and where do you think we actually are?
Well, that's certainly a story, right? And I don't want to discount that as a powerful story and a powerful influence in how we are consuming information today, because that does happen, right? And that we would be so concerned about that makes sense, particularly with technology advancing so rapidly, and now AI can peddle this stuff so much faster even than when we first started talking about this like 10 years ago. But it is just one story, right? Like, it's just one of the ways that we come by information. There are lots of reasons why people create content. There are lots of reasons why people share it. And there are a lot of reasons why we encounter information just moving through our daily lives. And to suggest that, like you said, that we're just these empty vessels sort of waiting to be fooled really discounts the agency that we have in just interacting with our world, right? Like, we're not just babies coming into this with no knowledge. We bring all of our context of all of our literacies to the table when we interact with information. And so I think one of the impetuses of starting to think about this article, like Michael said, is just sort of like, why are we focusing on people as these like blank slates, or just sort of waiting to be fooled? And that every interaction with information is about falling for something that's obviously not true, when we all know that we have been persuaded very, very effectively by any number of people, and not always for malicious reasons.
So, Michael, are you guys saying that you've looked at this and you found that very often we think about persuasion, like someone interacts with information, it's misinformation, and they're sort of hoodwinked, or they're persuaded to accept it as true? It almost sounds like you're saying more often than not, or at least another way to look at this, is that people don't necessarily like litigate the information. They're moving quickly. They see it. It provides them value. It maybe reinforces something they believe. Maybe it has other value to them, and they sort of adopt it and share it. Like, is that the play that you're trying to introduce here into the stream of the way we should think about this?
A lot of it comes down to thinking about cognitive bias. And, Kristy and our colleague and co-author, Sean Walker, and I talked a lot about how a lot of conversations about misinformation come down to cognitive bias, or ultimately deficits at the problem solving and critical thinking level. That you're either engaging in, you're just not educated enough, and so fact checking is going to help you, or you don't have enough critical thinking capacity, so you don't evaluate the source, or this is just buying into one of your confirmation biases or any number of cognitive biases, and that can explain it all. And I don't think we're trying to take away from the value of any of those ways of evaluating why misinformation spreads. But one of the things that's interesting is that there are other incentive systems at play for why people adopt misinformation. And so fact checking doesn't always work. You can tell someone something isn't true, and they might come back and say, no, it still is, because I don't trust your source. Or they might say, well, actually, I know it wasn't true, but I spread it anyway because I wanted to make somebody mad. So that kind of stuff, where that the information can have a kind of weaponizing effect, that information can really can signal your affiliation with a group, and that's actually valuable. It's more valuable than if it's true. That when you share it, it actually signals your allegiance to a group, and that is actually important. And so I think we're not trying to dismiss cognitive bias or some of these more individual cognitive level ways that people process information, but just that people are more complex than their biases, and that there are ways to have that are not necessarily bias related that also play into why you adopt and spread misinformation. And that goes to the individual level, or even the group level, or even at the level of social media platforms. Do we describe social media platforms as having a cognitive bias? I think we could, but that would really stretch the notion of a bias. And I don't want to eliminate the rigor of the idea of a cognitive bias, but if we just want to think about what the systemic biases are in platforms, that's worth thinking through from an economic incentives point of view, from a legislation point of view, even from, do they have content moderators or not, and what's their position? All of those things play into just the kind of base predilections of the platform itself. And so all of these things line up to make people vulnerable. If I'm consuming content on a platform that tends to show me a certain kind of content that makes me vulnerable, even though that doesn't, my cognitive bias hasn't changed, my information literacy hasn't necessarily changed. I just happen to have my browser tab open on a particular news website that just was default when I bought the computer, right? And that makes me vulnerable. I might not know that, right? So it's not always down to education, right? We know that education does help. We know that critical thinking does help. But there are these other things that are not necessarily reducible to those things that we're trying to capture, because we want to give tools and concepts to broaden our strategies to be able to mitigate and kind of talk through some of these issues.
Kristy, talk about that a little more, about what you guys found, because I think we're starting to understand the theory here that you're vulnerable to misinformation, and your vulnerability, it can be, but it's not necessarily tethered to like your education level, your health literacy levels. But it brings in this question of like value. What value is that information providing for you? Just walk us through, and Michael hit a bunch of them, but just walk us through slowly, like, what did you find are the different ways that misinformation can add value to someone's life?
Yeah, so in the paper, we outline several value types. And I want to be clear that this paper was really meant to be like a proposition, like a proposed framework for not only how to rethink, like Michael said, who might be vulnerable to or find value in different types of information, but also to think about bringing in different disciplines, right? So making sure we're taking an interdisciplinary look at these kinds of issues, because again, a lot of that research is, either done by like cognitive psychologists or computer scientists, and they're looking at these things from very different perspectives, right? From the perspective of the sender versus the perspective of the receiver. So we wanted to take a systems look and make sure that we were accounting for all the different factors and scales within a system. Again, that we're moving through this very complex environment. So I won't name them all, but a few of the value types that we list in the paper include sort of what is the epistemic value, or the usefulness in what it explains to us, how it makes sense for us. Sense making is like a primary activity that we engage in when we're looking at information.
Like, it's a complex world, or this topic is super complex. There's conflicting information. A piece of information lands and it makes instant sense to me. Like, this is clarifying.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even more than it just landing, I mean, a big part of how we engage with information is literally asking questions, right? Like going to Google and saying, why is this? Or who is that? And that's going to be even more the truth with AI, because it really is just like a generative question-oriented situation. I mean, like I always use the example of, I can't sit through a movie anymore without going on IMDb, because I need to know who that person is, right? And I'm not fact checking IMDb, but I'm trying to make sense of the world around me all the time. So that's kind of a primary one. But then another big one is that affective value. Like, what emotional support is this information providing for me? An example I always give is when I was becoming a mother. And I was very afraid of what was going to happen for any number of reasons. And I was trying to make sense of, pregnancy and being a new parent, what's going to happen? And should I sleep train my child? And I was trying to alleviate a lot of my anxieties and fears about that process while also making sense. Those things were happening at the same time. And there again, I am a well-educated person who wants to make sure I have the best information. So sure, I'm talking to my doctor, but I'm also looking at a lot of, new mom chat boards and that sort of thing. And so how that might hit me emotionally in that moment is different today, 13 years later, than it was when I was in the throes of it. So that affective piece is also really important.
Guys, I mean, this conversation is really eye-opening, and I think I have a really just basic question. And maybe you can answer it, maybe you can't. I don't know. I don't know what to do then. I just don't know what to do because I'm supposed to be, an expert in some ways. I'm supposed to be a journalist in some ways. I mean, what am I supposed to do with this? If we're supposed to say that, this misinformation is giving some value, what is the responsibility for us, as consumers of this and people who need to maybe act on things that we see?
I think one thing that if we want to think about maybe the ways that we're thinking about misinformation now, as a contrast, but I'll lay it out. And this is not meant to be a straw person argument in any way whatsoever. These do work, but they're not wholly sufficient to address the problem. So the idea of pre-bunking, right? So before a conspiracy comes out, we can kind of anticipate it's going to be on the way. And so we can kind of give people a heads up and give them the relevant information, right? That kind of pre-bunking or even immunological kind of idea that can work. There's ways that we can just make sure people have good critical thinking and media literacy skills. That does work. And we can make sure that we have fact checking available. That does work. And it is important that there is a record that, yes, for the record, even if it doesn't matter today, there is a record. This was fact checked. It's not true. Those things are still important. But I would move from, or I would add to, rather than how educated am I, how savvy am I, how well informed am I, how good of a media consumer am I, all of these focus on competencies. And that can trick us into thinking that we can be immune. And I know immunity is a really important metaphor for a lot of misinformation mitigation, but it's less useful if we imagine that once you're immune, you're always immune. Right. If we want to think about it as a very specific thing, you're immune to this strain on this date, and it's a rapidly transforming virus that, for me, I get more mileage out of that. I think the most important question to ask when you're sitting down at a computer or if you're opening up your phone is not what I know or how well trained I am, but what do I need today? What do I want to hear today? Do I feel like there's a lot of injustice out there? Do I want to hear moralizing content? Do I feel like the world doesn't make any sense and I want answers? These are really hard questions to answer. It used to be you would need to know what you were looking for when you went out to search for information. You would have to go to a building with all the information in it, and then you would have to ask somebody. You would have very specific questions about your quest. Now, information is so accidental, we reflect less and less about what we need to hear or what we want to hear. That layer becomes more and more invisible. And it is a very consequential layer when you're talking about processing all this stuff.
Michael, I think that's so interesting. And I want to dig a little further into Mark's question, because I think it's such an important one. And not just for clinicians like Mark and physicians like Mark, but really just anybody in a world of exchanging information and wanting to be in a relationship with somebody in their lives, whether it's a professional one or a friendship or neither, just making information as a journalist, to sort of feel like you're delivering something and there's you're effectively entering into some sort of a trust compact, right? And I can't help but think what I'm hearing you say is understanding what something can mean to someone is equally as important as the piece of information itself. And I guess that opens us up, Kristy, to how do you get to a place where you can quantify or even understand what information means to somebody? How do you ask the right questions? How do you get to that place where Mark can be like, look, these are the top 5 things. I mean, I don't think Mark actually practices this way, but I can imagine that there are doctors out there who are like, look, measles is dangerous. I got to get information out about the vaccine. I got to make people know that what the threat is. And it kind of doesn't matter if you're vaccine hesitant. It kind of doesn't matter. Like, I got to get this information out. Like, how should we approach trying to gauge what a piece of information can mean to somebody? Because effectively what you're saying is we can't just put information out in the world anymore. We have to figure out how to deliver it and how it lands.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And it's tough because this isn't always something that can scale as quickly and as broadly as you would want it to. But a lot of it, particularly from an expert perspective, comes down to relationship building, right? Because you're right, it is a trust compact. And, gone are the days of like, I have the expertise, I deliver it to you, sort of from on high. Like I deign this to be true and you're going to accept it because you know that I have the expertise. People just come into these situations with so much information themselves that they feel also like they're experts, right? And if they're not actually trained professional experts, they're experts of their own experience. And I think that's a piece of it that has been discounted in these relationships. We're talking about clinical relationships. That lived experience is often discounted in favor of like, this is what we know from the literature. This is what we know from practice. And listening to people's experiences can go a long way to try to understand where they're coming from, right? It doesn't mean you have to like take every lived experience as correct or every self-diagnosis as correct, but it is important to have a sense of who you're dealing with. So that person, one, feels heard and feels respected. And two, it allows the clinician or the expert in this case to say, oh, okay, I understand where you're coming from and potentially maybe where some of your biases or blind spots may be, right? Because you're right, like blanketing information, especially nowadays, it's just not going to work. And part of that is because we all, Michael said we used to have to go into the building to get the information. Well, now we just have all the information. And maybe it's not the best information or it's the same information, but we all feel like we're pretty well versed on something at that time.
How good are you at people at knowing that the misinformation that I'm being fed is like adding some value, even though I know it might not be, factually correct? How good are we at figuring that out for ourselves? I don't know if that makes sense, but I want to know, like, when I'm seeing something, am I able to discern?
I just want to say, I don't think most people are looking at information trying to discern it. They're trying to answer a question and then they move on. And so in most cases, you're like, is it going to rain? Yes, it's going to rain. Great. Grab my umbrella. And that's it, right? It's not really like I'm looking at a piece of information to decide if it's true or false. I think that's an important part of this conversation that like we have to understand. That's not usually people's impetus for trying to be informed.
And I just want to add one thing, Mark, because you're in skin cancer, that is your specialty. I will say, and you know this about me, Mark, because I frequently text you, I am so prone to misinformation about skincare. Like, I fully embrace it. I know what I'm looking at is probably bullshit, but for some reason, I have this thing in my head that like Western medicine and doctors don't understand skincare in the way that a lot of these people out there do. And it's something that I am more convinced by them. Now, Mark, I know Mark, he's a good friend. When Mark tells me stuff, I will listen to Mark. But there is something very appealing to me about seeing a world out there of people being like, look, this is just not something that the dermatologists really get. But this, like, you got to listen to this. I'm just being real honest with y'all.
So
it works for me.
Michael, use Brenda's example here. What biases is the piece of misinformation about skin confirming for her? What is she bringing to this, that these pieces of misinformation about skin care are resonating with her, even when she's like, I think it's bullshit, but I'll still go with it? Like, explain this to us.
There is this idea that if we don't trust medical professionals or the professionalized medical world and its associated institutions, that we are somehow going to outlive them. That there is this tacit assumption that we don't trust them now and they do not deserve our trust and we will not come back to them, right? We are making a break with them, and we don't have faith that they will improve, right? So I think when people start saying that we cannot trust the CDC anymore, I'm just going to go do my own thing. That is an exercise, and I feel like the future is far more individuated, that there's much less cooperation, or at least institutional, there's much less cooperation brokered by institutions, right? The cooperation is now individual to individual, right? So I'm not going to express an opinion one way or the other, which one, if ideally executed, is going to be better for everybody. It does really feel like medicine does great when there are standards. But that's me. When we think about, why people are vulnerable, it is not just necessarily about the medical issue itself, right? It's our orientation to institutions, right? And misinformation researchers understand this, that if you have low trust in institutions, then that changes what kind of misinformation you are vulnerable to. You want stuff that is going to empower you individually. And of course, there are many other instances of many other conspiracies that have the same basic structure, right? We talk about conspiracies as being the language of the disempowered. That's not always the case, but conspiracies or even misinformation can be very helpful ways to make you feel empowered in a situation where you may not feel particularly empowered, right? And so during COVID-19, when there were lots of conspiracies about the government wanting to purposefully kill you with a virus, there's these kinds of conspiracies that are completely fictitious. But then there are others that when you squint, you can see why people think them, right? That there are groups that are empowered, that are invested in them being unhealthy, and that makes them money. I do not think those two statements are untrue. And I think you can start to understand the appeal of why somebody would want to take control of their own health, not offload this decision-making anymore, and to feel more empowered about some of these basic decisions. And wouldn't you know it, because e-commerce is what it is today, I now have the means to realize that utopia that I see. So now biohacking is like much, much bigger, right? Now we have people putting plastic masks with red lights on their face right before they even talk to a dermatologist, right? We have people we have people who are distrustful of the CDC and the World Health Organization, who might not even have a primary care physician, who do not trust any of these institutions, but will order peptides from China.
Yeah.
I am that person.
I mean, I am
here to say I am that person. And I will, okay, a couple of y'all are raising your hands. I will just say this, and Mark, I'm so curious as to your take on this. Some of it comes from, I think, a genuine force that is at play in American society and all societies right now, which is viewing that institutions are not the only answer for something, that there are other stories to tell. Where I think that collides is that sometimes that can get really dangerous, but it's not always dangerous. There's a lot of skincare products I use that do make my skin better, and that people in like Mark's world would be like, oh my God, like she's so dumb for using this stuff. It doesn't actually work. I don't know that it doesn't work. It's not working. And it to me,
Right.
It is convincing me of a story that it is working.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what bar we're looking at. Like, are you looking at like evidence-based medicine? Are there things like doctors typically want to prescribe things that are evidence-based? And if we don't have the evidence, then we're not going to really recommend it. Again, does it mean that other thing is bad for you? No. But is it going to work? Are you being are you being convinced of something that might not be true? We don't know. I mean, look, I think the issue here is that the story can be emotionally satisfying, like your story of getting the skincare product and making you feel better, but it could also be wrong that it's helping you. And the fact that this misinformation about any of this, like it doesn't mean that just because it has value, like just because that makes you feel better, it doesn't mean that it's valid. Like it's just not valid.
Right. But it does
enough.
mean, I think, to pick up on the theory here, it does mean hitting Brenda with frequently asked questions and facts is not really going to solve this. Like, she's not really judging the information for veracity about the skincare treatment she's buying. She believes in it. It's doing other things for her. She's skeptical that, modern medicine's kind of figured it all out, and it just works for her. So
yeah,
like, I'll tell you,
we can
Mark,
accept that.
I love that Michael and Kristy are like, are y'all just going to be talking about skincare this whole time?
Yeah, we need to move on.
I think one of the things I want to say is that it's okay to have a variety of of these kinds of experiences in your life, right? Where the rubber meets the road is when you're doing something that's actually harmful to your health, right? And it's okay that you have different perspectives on this, and it's okay that some of your skincare products come from Instagram and some of them come from the doctor's office. Like, that's generally, I think, what part of the whole like ethos of the paper is, that we need to stop thinking in such like black or white ways about information, and that really it is we're moving through a whole lot of gray when we make decisions in our life. And once upon a time, evidence-based information was the purview of experts who had been trained in a specific way and could share that information from a place of confidence. And that was the transmission, that's how we learn stuff. And that's just not the dynamic anymore. And so part of it is just catching up to how we actually consume information and how we make these decisions. And again, like, I get recommendations from skincare from social media, but also from my friends and family. You know what I mean? It's not just a technological problem. It's not just a bot problem or an AI problem. It's just literally how we're making sense of the world. So many shades of gray in that. And what I would think we would want to challenge people to do is to have a better understanding, again, of why they're making those choices, right? So just knowing for yourself what's moving you to do these things and what are the different dynamics at play. Why am I continuing to see this ad for this retinol product? You should have an understanding of that so that you can understand. If you decide to buy it, that's fine. Totally your decision. But you should understand that there are economic and platform and different types of forces at work also kind of helping you along in that decision. But
and
I think
asterisk, one asterisk, there are some bad actors. Let's just put that out there.
Yeah.
Of course there are. And also evidence is important, right? We're trained researchers, and so we believe in evidence. So it's not like we want to just say, oh, you can just accept any old thing, and as long as it doesn't kill you, it's fine. That's not the case. Of course, there are things we want to be sure we're emphasizing, and we want to bring up when there is wrong stuff and when there are bad actors trying to push bad agendas. Sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole, so I'm going to stop.
No, it's okay. I want to just add one thing. I know Tom has a question. Michael, in some ways, this actually reminds me of stuff that, Tom and Mark and I have seen in journalism in terms of like just mainstream journalism, where for years, we worked at the three networks we worked at ABC. I also worked at CBS. Mark is still at ABC. And for a long time, for decades, it was the authority, right? And in many ways, you had the three networks, then you had you had newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, and what they said, and then you had the newswire services. It was like this little ecosystem that was very influential. And I would say, in some ways, even more than doctors and scientists, journalists have now for decades been wrestling and sharing space with different types of people who are now conveying information. And for us to say that all those people are now just bad faith actors who are citizen journalists, believe me, there are people out there who don't know. I still am one of those old school people who believe that journalism is a skill and a craft, and it requires a certain consideration in how you do it. And there's people out there who are very thoughtless, but I'm also learning a lot from all this new crop of citizen journalists and this new crop of people out there who are doing things in a different way. And I'm curious as to whether there is a parallel, or with science and medicine, it's just necessarily different. Michael, I wonder if you can take that. And then Tom, go for it.
So, I mean, I think the disaggregation that you point to is interesting, right? Because I think when we think about all of these different kind of agglomerated trust mechanisms, right? Once we disaggregate them, we have a lot more work to do individually. And I think when we live in an environment whose specialization is indulging every question or idea or need that we might have, or imagined need that we might have, it's harder to take responsibility for what am I actually looking for when I'm online. I think when it comes to medicine and health, yeah, I think being able to, because as we discussed, just trying to say that skincare product isn't going to do anything for you, or hey, you're trying to rehab off an orthopedic surgery. Well, that treatment isn't. Don't go in a cold tub. That's not going to stop people from trying a cold tub. There are ways to, I think, absent advice from professionalized and credentialed experts, And if people are not going to listen to that advice because of their various mistrusts or wherever they're at, then, other technologies they need are how to be a social validating person, or it's a bad way of putting it, but how am I going to, with my peers, figure out what's good for me? And that I can't just take somebody's word for it. So how do I go from being somebody who is just purely social and how I do this stuff to actually work on some collective thinking? Because there's a difference, right? Of just doing something because it's mimicry and actually reasoning through something collectively. And that's really idealistic, but I think that if we're trying to think about if some of these things are going to be disaggregated and people are going to be free agents for information, if you will, and they're not going to have the same allegiances, then, our next level of kind of education for people, or trying to help them to learn how to be not harmed or exploited in these environments, I think requires just meeting them where they are, as you say.
I want to pick up on that phrase of like collective thinking, because we've talked a lot about like our individual interactions with information. And that sort of takes us to the conspiracy theory part of this. And you guys did a really interesting thing in your piece where you laid your framework against these two conspiracy theories that kind of competed for people's attention after the Butler assassination attempt on President Trump, now President Trump again. There was the deep state theory that maybe the Biden administration sort of like opened the door to a shooter to slice right through the security and get a shot, or that the Secret Service kind of like backed off and wasn't as aggressive because it kind of allowed someone to penetrate and take a shot at President Trump. And then on the flip side, there was the false flag theory, which was this is a lot of staged acting. They're all in on it. This was never an actual assassination attempt. It was just meant to make Trump look good. I guess, Kristy, just talk to us a little bit about how your framework can help us understand why both theories took off. Because I think a lot of people look at this and think both these theories are nuts. And how could all these people be duped? And what is wrong with our society that we've got like lots of people who are buying into this stuff?
Well, there's a lot of examples in history of times where maybe, people in power weren't 100% truthful about what was going on. So we have a lot of precedent for like maybe being skeptical, and that has been accelerated and compounded recently. And our politically charged environment doesn't help, right? But I think it was a fun exercise to sort of break down these competing conspiracy theories that sort of come to the same conclusion, which is essentially that this assassination attempt is not what it seems, right? I think that's like the overarching conspiracy, is that someone is hiding something from us. And it doesn't really matter where you come from, but that, from what your entry point is, but that's essentially what we think. And I think that by walking through the different sort of aspects of value to come to these, like the same conclusion from competing sides, for me, it shows that reducing things to like a left or right perspective is just incredibly reductive, that everything is political affiliation. And that's why I decide something feels very limiting as a construct right now, because there are so many different pieces of this that you might believe or not believe for different reasons. And again, political affiliation is very strong right now, and it's sort of front and center in the way that people characterize themselves. But being able to look at those different levels, like what was the entertainment value of each theory, for instance, or again, kind of back to what emotion did this stir for me? Like what role did algorithms have to play in this? Again, just that awareness that this is a multifaceted information environment that we live in is useful, I think, not only in the study of conspiracy theories and misinformation, but also in helping people to understand sort of why they arrive at these conclusions. And also, I think we also need to remember that most people don't actually believe these theories. Like they might share them and be like, oh, it could be, right? Like, I don't know.
Was that
Like
just
the false
entertainment value?
The false flag one is more of that, right?
Yes,
like people
right.
didn't actually believe it, but they like the spirit of it, which is don't believe this guy. Don't believe what you're seeing. He's acting. He's getting political benefit from this, right?
Yeah. And it's important to remember that, gullibility is a piece of this too, right? And we have there, we range in how gullible we are for certain things. And maybe that's not the best way to describe it, but we range in sort of how deeply we want to hold on to some of these things, depending on how invested we are in the topic. And our concern as experts, our concern as people who want the world to be just a more copacetic place is like, we have to understand that not everyone is making these like really dire decisions on this information. They might just share a post. So a lot of the research that's like misinformation spreads twice as fast as regular information like that little nugget of information gets shared again and again and again. I'm not disputing that research isn't accurate and valid, and that a viral piece of misinformation can spread much faster than like a New York Times article can. But that also makes us think that then everyone is believing that, right? And that's a step farther than what the research actually says, right? Just because it travels so far doesn't mean we're all adopting it. And I think that's an important distinction.
Is AI like already like 2 steps ahead of us on all this? Do they know that like, okay, there's the misinformation, and they know that like they already read your paper, by the way, and like they are already modeling our next answer basically on the like emotional part of us versus like the factual part of us? Is that already happening with AI?
AI is a really interesting extension of some of the things that we're talking about. So if we're thinking about, the assassination attempt as this, one of those few events that everyone watched, that's what made say such an interesting case. We can have arguments about what color the pool in Washington is right now, but everyone saw the assassination attempt. And so it's rife for kind of competing explanations. And sometimes you don't need much other than everyone to see the same thing in a really polarized environment to start seeing the effects of polarization. But when it comes to AI, I feel like, when we talked about where you're vulnerable and that you might be vulnerable at an individual level based on certain kinds of value you might derive. And you might be vulnerable socially for different kinds of social needs you might have. And you might be vulnerable based on the platform you're on, because that platform has certain contingencies and interests, economic, et cetera. But then AI is kind of like, another layer to this, that AI is kind of a prior for a lot of the ways that some of these systems work. So many internet searches now are not performed by people. They're performed by AI agents on behalf of human queries. And interestingly enough, in a weird kind of twist of fate, the interface for ChatGPT looks really similar to the interface for Google. As the interface, it's just a box and a button again. And we put the question in and the information comes out. So I think that when we think about AI, it's much more difficult to trace where some of the bias and incentives are coming from. But we do know that it's so suffused that we should treat it as just part of our information environment and part of the way that you're just going to be thinking, right? So to think about, it's my position that like, and I think it's an extension of our work, that if you're thinking about AI as just a tool you opt into or not, then that isn't a robust position from an information warfare perspective, from a misinformation perspective, and from an information literacy perspective, that you want to be able to treat these as basically conditions of your environment. AI is indulgent in the way that we have seen misinformation indulge different needs or predilections or biases, right? So, Kristy and I and Sean, tried to create a scaffold based on a lot of theoretical work and a case study, right, to be able to show that a lot of times what makes misinformation successful is it gives us what we want. And I would contend that what makes AI successful is it gives us what we want. And so making sure that we understand that that is a very important condition and that there are very similar dynamics going on with some of these large language model based systems that we see in misinformation, and that we think of it as an information competition, where all this information is just competing for attention. And human generated, non-human generated, is it part of an actual news story or narrative, or is it just part of the fabric of your search or how you make sense of the world? It's all kind of melting together.
Yeah, it's I feel like we're getting like the teaser for like a new horror film, because when you talk about AI and the commercial interests of AI, it could be as simple as just keeping you on the AI as long as possible. And if it knows the buttons to push that you've identified here in your theory, like make the information resonate with the user based on their prior biases, leverage the fact that they want to be accepted by a larger group, make this sort of emotional for them. Like the AI could be turbocharged to spread misinformation if it's torqued in the right way to kind of hit all these value points that you guys have identified. That starts to get really frightening, because we all feel that sycophancy with AI, like it's trying to please you and keep you on there, and given kind of your value points, it could really spread misinformation, it seems to me. Kristy, am I overblowing this, or?
No, I don't think so, unfortunately. I mean, it's interesting now because a lot of AI chatbot use is not social, right? It's very personal. You're just kind of doing it on your own. I mean, that's a little bit different maybe if you're using like the Gemini, like, Google search results. That is a little bit more social pot responses, but like it'll be interesting to see how if AI tools become more social, and so that there's that like sharing dynamic that's more akin to like social media. I mean, I'm sure people are sharing what they learn from AI peer to peer or in a group chat or something like that. But it's not like, it's not a mechanism of AI currently where you would just forward your response. So it feels a little bit more like you're creating a relationship with your chatbot in that way. So it'll be interesting to see if that accelerates even more if someone develops a platform, not to give anyone ideas, that is more social. Certainly a lot of the content that's being shared right now on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook is being created by AI. So maybe that's already happening, but just, we don't really realize it, that we're interfacing in that way. Another thing that's interesting to me about AI is that, I don't know if y'all have noticed this, but there's this is like a fake news statistic, so don't quote me on this, but there is maybe upwards of 50% of the content online is generated by AI now. And I notice it, I'm wondering if you've noticed it, and just sort of like the like trite sort of news types of stuff that you read. And it's not misinformation, and it's not really, it's just like generic, bland, milk toasty, like, here's a story about something that's happening. And you read it and you're like, I think a human wrote this. And if they did, I feel bad for that human, because it's not particularly well written, but it's not offensive and it's not necessarily false. It's just like a repackaging of information. And a lot of the internet to me feels like that right now. In this,
it's almost like you're identifying, it's like the craziest feedback loop, right? Which is we're searching for things that it's then spitting back out at us, which is being written by the things we're searching for. And yeah, I mean, the one thing, Tom, to your point, that I've also heard is like, weirdly, at a time where people are mistrustful of authorities, could AI act as like the great equalizer for certain people out there who may trust their AI over their doctor, because their doctor doesn't, maybe they know that their doctor's a Democrat, or they know that their doctor, like they think their doctor's elitist or something, so it's going to give them a different response than their AI. And there's some question about whether in the vaccine conversations that AI can actually be something that generates trust. I don't know. We'll keep monitoring that. But as we kind of wrap up here, the one thing I'm realizing is this idea that official narratives in general are not very welcome these days. Whether you're looking at, who killed Charlie Kirk, or the truth about the Epstein files, or who really attempted to assassinate Trump, or whatever, right? Like we very quickly sort ourselves into, who believes the official narrative and who doesn't. And if you believe the official narrative, you're like this rube who doesn't really get the world as it is, right? The one place where I don't see this happening, and I'm curious about it, is in sports. So for instance, when the Knicks win, right? Because we talk about that a lot on the show. No one really disputes that they won the game, right? No one disputes that like Jalen Brunson hit that point and then OG went in for the tip. Like there's no like, well, let's reframe that video. And like you've got Megyn Kelly and Donald Trump cheering for the Knicks win, just like you have Barack Obama and Ben Stiller cheering for the Knicks win, right? It's like this weird place where misinformation doesn't actually thrive. And part of it is because we're all rooting for something And it may be that the stakes are somehow lower, although you ask fans who've been waiting for this for 50 years and they may not agree. But I just wonder if there's something about not just how we value information, but how we value like events in our lives in general that sort of allows us to root for facts in certain instances and not in others. Michael, Kristy, I wonder if you can kind of help us out with that as a final thought.
So that sounds very like uplifting and hopeful, and so I'm sorry to ruin it. As
I knew it. Spoil it, baby.
As a Knicks hater.
Oh no!
I know,
okay,
I know.
Out there.
Bring it on.
I know. So, but as somebody who wasn't interested in a Knicks victory, I was served all kinds of content about the officiating, about the economic incentives of making sure a large market team got more games, got a championship. I was served all kinds of information, like deliberations about just how vulnerable basketball is to officiating, and a capricious official can swing a series. And that even subconsciously, the effect of the home crowd just kind of emotionally swaying the referee to not get yelled at again and again can create, like, basketball is just a 5-person sport, and fouls are very, very meaningful, even as a deterrent, right? We got so much conversation previous in the series when Oklahoma City was playing, right? And there was so much attention on the officials. There was so much attention on the fouls. There was so much conspiracy talk about who's going to win and who's not. It doesn't make any sense that the NBA is economically incentivized to make sure that the Oklahoma City television market gets more and more. No, but it doesn't matter. The conspiracies are out there anyway. And I think sports is a great example for this, because sports are when we are at our most irrational. I want my team to win no matter what. I don't care. I will even dislike other people because they don't like my team. We have people fighting other human beings in real time at sports events because they like a different team. And so people feel a lot about these kinds of events. So they are perfect for conspiracy theories because people want an outcome so badly, or they want that outcome to be valid. They want that outcome to be valuable enough to stand up in the trophy case next to the other legendary titles. So they don't want an asterisk by the title. They want it to be a really good title. And so in that case, right, we want that outcome so much, we are very vulnerable to misinformation, right?
Boy,
I am.
Michael, that just blew my mind, because I'll tell you, in that case, I think what you're identifying is that like Megyn Kelly, Donald Trump, Ben Stiller, and Barack Obama are actually culturally aligned in one tiny little way that is allowing them to agree on this. Not that actually sports is this great equalizer, but
and
that
also,
there's an right. Yeah, Tom,
and
go
also
ahead.
your feed was telling you a different story, which is sports is the one place where it's all transparent. We all see it, and the one team wins, and that's factual, and there's no shenanigans. And Michael's was feeding him like, don't believe what you see.
God damn it.
So
we can't
it's all the
this.
same.
We can't fix this.
We basically want my team to win. So no matter what, if it's in science, if it's in this, it's just my team's got to win. It's basically what I've learned.
That framing, Mark, is actually really clarifying for me, that we're all rooting for a team. Like that's what our discourse is right now. We're all rooting for
but
teams.
It's not just binary of like right left anymore. It's we could be aligned on Israel. We could be and be different
retinol.
parties.
I'm rooting for retinol.
Spurs and be different parties.
I'm anti-wrinkle. Kristy, you had a thought.
I was just going to say that to maybe put a slightly different spin on it, you kind of just took it in this direction. Like, fandom is its own sociocultural phenomenon, right? And there have been great books written about all kinds of different fandoms and the ways that we contribute to and participate in fandoms. And I think that participation is key, right? Like, we are in it in a way that for a lot of the information we consume, we're not in it at all, right? It's glancing over us. We're just barely engaging. We are in it when we are fans of whatever we're fans of. And I think that's great, because that is when we stop and we pay attention and we start to parse things and we think more, maybe not more clearly, but more deeply about things, right? We still might be emotionally pulled by our love or hate of the Knicks, whatever it is, but we are thinking more intentionally because we are invested. And so I think finding those moments where we're invested, whether it's skincare or it's it's basketball, that's where like sort of some of this magic happens because we do care. The thing about sports being a great equalizer and maybe an AI buster is that it is still large. It does still happen in person too. You know, I mean, I know most of us watched it on TV because it is prohibitively expensive to get a ticket to those games, which is a conspiracy theory too. But they are still like human to human. You know, like we're collecting together and having these moments together. And so even if we disagree about every other thing, if we're fans together in that moment, that's a lovely, beautiful moment. And even in our loss, we can align with people who the big losers, the Spurs fans can be collective in their sadness. And then one last thing about sports, which is really interesting, is that it is so predictably cyclical, right? Better luck next year. And there always is a next year. And so we, like Mark said, we want our team to win. So as soon as we know they're not going to win, we invest into the next season, right? We start thinking about a draft and we thinking about recruits and we think what's going to happen, how we're going to build a different team. So it never ends. Like it just is something we can invest in forever. And that's lovely.
This was like a crazy fun conversation. It really opened my mind. I'm so grateful to both of you for coming on our show today. Kristy, Roschke, and Michael Simeone, they authored this peer-reviewed article titled "Value and Vulnerability: A Framework for Understanding the Complexity of Misinformation Use." We will drop it in the show notes. Thank you to both of you for joining us on Why Should I Trust You today.
Thanks so much for having us.
And that is our show. Please send us questions and comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. Please rate, like, subscribe, all that stuff. I am Brenda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. He is Dr. Mark Abdul Malik. She is Maggie Bartlett. And we will see you right back here next week.